It is almost 3 in the morning, and the mountains are black. A man drops out of a plane he can no longer hear. His boots hit the wet grass wrong, and he goes down hard. And for one single breath, he is alive and free and 30 miles behind enemy lines with a radio strapped to his chest and a country's hopes pinned to his back. Then he hears it, the click of a rifle bolt, then another, then a whole ring of them all around him in the dark, men who were already there, men who knew the exact field, the exact hour, the exact night he would fall out of that sky. Someone had told them. Someone far away, in a warm, dry office in London, with a cup of tea going cold on the desk and a photograph of the king on the wall. They did not take him prisoner. They took his code book and his boots and whatever the rest of him was worth, and they left him in the grass. He was one of many. Over the years, the men who dropped people like him into the dark counted their dead in the hundreds, and never once suspected that the traitor was sitting 3 doors down from them in London, reading their plans, signing their orders, and passing every one across to the other side. For 30 years, one man handed Moscow everything Britain knew. He hunted Soviet spies for a living. He was the Soviet spy. And the more of his own people he betrayed, the higher his own service promoted him. How does a man like that walk free for a quarter of a century, trusted, decorated, one lunch away from running the whole show? It cost more lives than anyone has ever been able to count. It's all in this file. You're listening to the Betrayal Files. I am putting a folder on the desk now. It is thicker than most. The tab along the edge is worn soft from handling, and the word stamped across the cover has faded almost to gray. Declassified. The case file reads, Harold Adrian Russell Philby, but nobody ever called him that. Friends, enemies, wives, handlers, the men who trusted him and the men who died for it, every one of them knew him by a single name. Kim. British by birth, Cambridge by education. Recruited by Soviet intelligence in 1934, when he was just 22 years old. He would spend the next 3 decades inside British secret intelligence, MI6, climbing at his peak to run the very department built to hunt down and destroy Soviet spies. Some of what is in this folder, London only admitted after he was dead. Some of it is still sealed, and some of it was never written down at all, because the people who could have told the story were already in unmarked graves. The stakes here are simple. He was Moscow's man at the beating center of Western intelligence, the friend of the CIA, the pride of the Secret Service, the last man on earth anyone would ever suspect. This is how he did it, and this is what it cost. He was born on the 1st day of January, 1912, in Ambala, in the heat and red dust of British India. It was the high noon of empire, and Kim Philby was, from birth, a child of that empire, raised to believe he was one of the people the world was built to be run by. His father made sure of that. St. John Philby, spelled St. John, but say it St. John, was one of the strangest Englishmen of his generation. An explorer, an Arabist, a colonial official who quit in disgust, crossed the empty quarter of Arabia, and became a personal advisor to Ibn Saud, the king who gave his name to Saudi Arabia. He converted to Islam. He took a second wife. He argued with everyone on principle all his life. And he named his son Kim, after the boy in Rudyard Kipling's novel, an orphan who slips between worlds, who belongs to 2 masters at once, who is trained from childhood to be a spy. Kim Philby grew up worshipping and fearing that man in equal measure. He would spend his whole life trying to outdo him, and half of everyone who studied the case has wondered whether every secret he ever stole was really just one more argument with his father. He went to Westminster, one of the great English schools, and then, in 1929, at 17, to Trinity College, Cambridge. He was clever, but quietly clever. He had a stammer, a small, catching hesitation in his speech, and that stammer would turn out to be one of the most valuable weapons he ever owned. Because a man who stammers seems honest, seems vulnerable, seems like a man with nothing to hide. People leaned in to help him finish his sentences and never once imagined what those sentences were really carrying. Cambridge in those years was not a calm place. The Great Depression had thrown millions of ordinary men out of work. Hunger marchers walked the roads of England, and across the Channel, in Germany and Italy, fascism was rising like a black tide, and the governments of the West seemed either asleep or quietly on its side. To a lot of clever, angry young men, communism did not look like treason. It looked like the only side willing to fight. Philby graduated in 1933. On his way out the door, he went to see one of his tutors, a committed Marxist economist, and asked him a simple question: what should he do with his life? The answer he got back was just as simple: devote it to the cause of communism. So he did, but not the way the tutor meant. That summer, Philby went to Vienna. Austria was tearing itself apart, a small, fragile republic being crushed between the fascists and the workers. And there, in the poorest streets of the city, Philby met a young woman named Litzy Friedman. She was a communist. She was Jewish. She was married and getting a divorce, and utterly fearless. And Kim Philby fell for her completely. In February of 1934, the Austrian government turned its artillery on the workers' housing blocks of Vienna and opened fire. Men Philby had shaken hands with were shot in the streets or dragged off to be hanged. And in the middle of that, the smoke, the searches, the terror, Philby and Litzy hid fugitives, carried messages, and smuggled hunted socialists out of the country ahead of the police. Then he did something that looked, on paper, like love. He married her. He married Litzy Friedman so she could travel on a British passport, so she could get out of Austria alive. And when he brought her home to England in the spring of 1934, he brought home, without knowing it yet, the thing that would end him. Because Litzy knew people. And those people had been watching young Kim Philby very, very closely. In June of 1934, a man asked Philby to meet him on a bench in Regent's Park in the middle of London in broad daylight. The man's name was Arnold Deutsch. He was a talent spotter for Soviet intelligence, brilliant, warm, patient, and he had a very particular kind of recruit in mind. He did not want a poor man who could be bought. He wanted the opposite. He wanted the golden boys of the English ruling class, Cambridge men, the sons of empire, the young men destined to walk straight into the Foreign Office and the Secret Service and the corridors of British power. He wanted moles who would rise, sleepers who would wait 10, 20, 30 years, and then be sitting at the top of the tree when Moscow finally came knocking. He gave Philby a code name, Zöhnchen, Little Son, and the very first order he gave him was the strangest one of all. Break with communism, completely, publicly. From this day, Deutsch told him, you are no longer a man of the left. You will drop your radical friends. You will let the world believe you have grown out of your student politics, or worse, that you have swung the other way. And Philby obeyed. He resigned from every progressive cause he had ever touched. He started drinking with the wrong sort of people on purpose, and within 2 years he had joined the Anglo-German Fellowship, a fashionable little club of Englishmen who admired Adolf Hitler. Old friends were disgusted. They thought Kim had lost his mind or his soul. Not one of them guessed the truth, that the more of a fascist he pretended to be, the deeper he was burrowing for Moscow. He needed a career that would carry him towards secrets. He chose journalism. And in 1937, he talked his way into Spain, into the middle of the Spanish Civil War, as a correspondent, reporting from the side of the fascist general Franco. One winter day near the front, Philby was sitting in a car with 3 other journalists when a shell came down almost on top of them. The other 3 men were killed or dying. Philby walked away with a scratch on the head. And Franco's people, impressed by the cool English reporter who had cheated death, pinned a medal on him, a Spanish decoration for bravery, handed to him personally by the general himself. A Soviet agent, decorated by the fascists for surviving a shell that killed the men beside him. He kept that medal. He understood, better than anyone, exactly what it was worth as a disguise. And he was not alone. Deutsch and his handlers had been busy at Cambridge, and around Philby they built a network that history would come to call the Cambridge Five. There was Donald Maclean, cool and clever, headed for the very top of the Foreign Office. There was Guy Burgess, brilliant, reckless, drunk, indiscreet, and somehow untouchable. There was Anthony Blunt, an art historian who would one day advise the Queen herself on her paintings. And there was John Cairncross, the quiet one, the man some would call the fifth man. 5 young Englishmen at the heart of the establishment, 5 Soviet spies. And Kim Philby was the finest of them all. Then, in 1940, war gave him the door he had been waiting for. A friend inside the Secret Service, Guy Burgess, put in a word. And Kim Philby, the man Moscow had been growing like a seed for 6 long years, walked straight into British intelligence. They never checked. They never checked because he was one of us. His father was famous. His school was the right school. His accent was the right accent. Who on earth would ever suspect a man like that? Inside MI6, Philby rose like a man who had been built for it. Because he had been. He started in sabotage and propaganda. Then he was sent to a country house at Beaulieu, say it Bewley, to help train the agents Britain was dropping into occupied Europe. Think about that for a moment. The men and women he trained, the faces he memorized, the missions he learned by heart. A copy of all of it went to Moscow. Some of those agents were caught the instant they landed. Nobody could work out why. By 1944, with the war turning, London looked ahead to the next enemy, the Soviet Union, and created a brand new department to fight it, Section 9. Its whole purpose was counterintelligence against Soviet and communist spying, and the man they chose to run it was Kim Philby. Read that again. The head of Britain's anti-Soviet spy-catching section was a Soviet spy. The fox was not merely in the henhouse. The fox had been handed the keys, the payroll, and a seat on the board. For years it ran like clockwork. He would spend the day at the office, reading the most secret traffic in the building. He would slip files or his own careful notes out under his coat. He would meet his handler in a quiet street, hand across a roll of film, and be home for supper. Every British operation aimed at the Soviets crossed his desk. And everything that crossed his desk crossed to Moscow. But a double life is not a smooth machine. It is a series of near misses. And Philby's first true near miss came in the autumn of 1945 in Istanbul. A Soviet intelligence officer named Konstantin Volkov walked into the British consulate and offered to defect. In exchange for money and safety, he said he would name Soviet agents inside Britain. And among the names he promised was a Soviet spy who was, his exact phrase, the acting head of a section of British counter-espionage in London. He was describing Kim Philby. Without knowing his name, Volkov was describing the very man the case would be handed to. And it was handed to Philby. Of course it was. He ran the section. He volunteered to fly out and manage it personally. Then he made sure to be slow. He warned Moscow first. And by the time Philby's plane touched down in Istanbul, Konstantin Volkov and his wife were gone. Days later, witnesses at the airport saw a Soviet military aircraft. They saw 2 figures carried aboard on stretchers, bandaged, unconscious, drugged. Volkov was flown back to Moscow, and Moscow did to him what Moscow did. He was never seen again. He had come within a few days of naming the greatest traitor in British history, and the traitor himself buried him. Philby wrote it up as a failure, a pity, a defector who lost his nerve. His superiors sighed and moved on. Nobody asked the one question that would have ended everything. Why had the officer sent to save Volkov been the slowest man in the service? In 1949, they promoted him again, and this time they sent him to the biggest prize of all, Washington. Philby became the senior link between British intelligence and the Americans, the CIA and the FBI, the newborn giants of the Western spy world. He sat in on their most guarded secrets. He read their cables. He drank their whiskey. And he made a friend. A young, brilliant, intense CIA officer named James Jesus Angleton. The two of them lunched together for hours, week after week, trading gossip and theory and the deepest secrets of both nations over long, boozy afternoons. Angleton thought he was learning from a master. He was. He was teaching Moscow's man the entire architecture of American intelligence, one lunch at a time. Stop and measure what this was. One man now held in his head the crown jewel secrets of the British and the American services at the same time. There has probably never been a penetration like it before or since. And with that access, Philby helped destroy one of the West's boldest gambles of the early Cold War. Britain and America had a plan to roll back communism, to slip armed agents, exiles, and volunteers into Albania to spark an uprising against its Stalinist regime. Wave after wave went in, by parachute, by boat, across the mountains, and wave after wave was met by soldiers who were already waiting, who knew the fields, the beaches, the timings, the passwords. Because Kim Philby was one of the officers running the operation, and Kim Philby told Moscow everything. How many died in those Albanian mountains has never been agreed. The estimates run from the dozens into the hundreds, and the true figure is buried with them. What is not in doubt is why they died. They died because a gentleman in Washington, trusted by two governments, picked up a telephone. By now, Philby was being talked about as a future chief of the entire Secret Intelligence Service. The traitor was one promotion away from running British espionage on Earth. He had climbed almost to the very top. He did not know how little time he had left. He did not know that, 2 desks away in Washington, a code-breaking project was quietly closing in on the people he loved. It did not begin with Philby. It began with a whisper of decrypted Soviet cable traffic, a secret American project so guarded it barely had a name. Patiently reading messages the Soviets had believed unbreakable. Buried in that traffic was a Soviet spy inside the British Embassy in Washington during the war, codename Homer. For years, Homer was a ghost. Then, in the spring of 1951, the code breakers narrowed it down to one man. Donald Maclean, Philby's old Cambridge friend. One of the 5. Philby, sitting in Washington, saw the noose tightening around Maclean before Maclean did. And Philby had a problem. Because if they arrested Maclean and Maclean broke, the whole network could come down, including him. He had to warn Maclean to run. But he could not do it himself from Washington without pointing the finger straight back at his own chest. So he used the wildest card in his hand, Guy Burgess. Burgess was living in Philby's own house in Washington by then, drinking, scandalizing everyone, a walking disaster. Philby arranged for Burgess to disgrace himself, to get sent home to London in a hurry on a cloud of speeding tickets and bad behavior, carrying the warning with him. Get Maclean out. Do not, whatever you do, get caught yourself, and do not run with him. Burgess got the message to Maclean, and then Burgess, reckless, frightened, drunk Guy Burgess, did the one thing Philby had begged him not to do. On the 25th of May, 1951, Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess fled Britain together and vanished behind the Iron Curtain. 2 of them, together, and one of them had been living under Kim Philby's roof. The Americans did the arithmetic in an afternoon. Who was Burgess close to? Who had Burgess been staying with? Who, in the whole service, sat closest to the secrets that just walked out the door? The finger pointed at Philby, and it never fully came down again for the rest of his life. The press invented a name for the man who must have tipped off the runaways, the man who warned them, the man still hidden. They called him the Third Man. London recalled Philby. In a bare room, an MI5 interrogator named Helenus Milmo, a barrister, sharp as a blade, took him apart hour after hour, trying to break the story. But there was no confession, because Philby did not confess. He leaned on the old stammer. He got vague in exactly the right places. He gave them a performance of a wronged, bewildered patriot, and he gave them nothing they could take to a court. There was no proof. There is a difference in England between a man everyone knows is guilty and a man you can convict. Philby lived for 12 more years in that gap. They could not hang him. So they did the English thing. They eased him out. They made him resign from the Secret Service, quietly, with a handshake and a small payment, and they let the door close without a sound. No trial, no headlines, no name in the papers. For 4 years, Kim Philby simply disappeared into ordinary life, watched, suspected, and untouchable. Then, in 1955, it broke into the open. A member of Parliament stood up under the protection of the House and named Philby out loud as the Third Man. The government had to answer, and the man who answered was the Foreign Secretary, Harold Macmillan, who stood up in the House of Commons and said of Kim Philby, "I have no reason to conclude that Mr. Philby has at any time betrayed the interests of this country." The British government cleared him, in public, on the record. They handed the greatest traitor in their history a certificate of innocence, because admitting the truth was more frightening than the lie. And Philby? Philby held a press conference in his mother's flat in front of a room full of reporters and cameras, calm as a man discussing the weather. He looked them in the eye and said the words, "I have never been a communist." The stammer was perfect. The smile was easy. It may be the most breathtaking lie ever told to a British camera. The whole room believed him. They even found him a way back into the shadows. He went out to Beirut as a journalist, a correspondent for respectable papers, and quietly off the books, he began feeding information to the very Secret Service that had just thrown him out. They could not quite convict him. They could not quite let him go. So they kept him, half in, half out, in the warm Mediterranean light, for years. But the past was walking toward him. In late 1961, a senior Soviet officer named Anatoly Golitsyn, say it Golitsyn, defected to the West and began describing a ring of British spies recruited at Cambridge in the 1930s. And then a woman named Flora Solomon, who had known Philby for decades, told the authorities something she had held onto for 25 years. That back before the war, Kim Philby had tried to recruit her, too, for the Soviets. This time there was no gap to hide in. This time they had him. So London made a choice that tells you everything about how this ended. They did not send the police. They did not send an arrest warrant. They sent a friend. They sent Nicholas Elliott, a senior MI6 officer who had known Philby, trusted Philby, defended Philby to his face for years, out to Beirut, alone, to sit down across a table from him and get the truth. They had been friends for the better part of 20 years. Elliot had staked his own name and career on Philby's innocence, and now he sat in a flat in Beirut, listening to the man he loved like a brother finally, quietly, admit that all of it, had been true. That every dinner, every confidence, every shared secret across 2 decades of friendship had been an act. Philby gave a partial confession. He signed something, and Elliot, for reasons still argued over to this day, flew home, and left him there, free, unwatched, in a city with a Soviet harbor. On the night of the 23rd of January, 1963, Kim Philby went out into the rain. He was supposed to be at a dinner party. He never arrived. He walked down to the docks, and a Soviet freighter, bound for the Soviet Union,
took him aboard and slipped out to sea. By the time anyone in London understood he was gone, he was already behind the Iron Curtain, standing at last on the soil of the country he had served in secret for nearly 30 years. Moscow should have been the happy ending of his story. It was not. He arrived expecting to be received as a hero, as a general, as a master of the trade come home in triumph. What he got was an apartment, a pension, a KGB minder, and a long, cold distance. They never fully trusted him, this Englishman who had lied to everyone for 30 years. Why would they assume he had stopped? They kept him at arm's length. They gave him the rank of colonel, not the general stars he believed he had earned. They did not let him near real operations.
For a long time, the greatest spy of the century sat in a flat in Moscow with nothing to do. He drank heavily. He grew depressed. There were bad nights and worse ones, and some who knew him believed he came close to ending it himself. The women in his life had paid too. One of his wives, back in England, had slowly understood who her husband really was and had drunk herself into an early grave inside that knowledge. His children grew up under the shadow of the name. In Moscow, in the end, a Russian woman named Rufina married him and kept him alive through the worst of it. In 1968, he published a memoir called My Silent War, cool, elegant, unrepentant, still lying by the paragraph even as it told a kind of truth. He said he had never doubted, never regretted, never once thought of himself as a traitor. He had served, he insisted, the same cause his whole adult life. To him, the betrayal was never a betrayal at all. He simply belonged to the other side from the beginning, and everyone else had failed to notice. The wreckage he left behind did not stop at the graves in Albania or the stretches in Istanbul. In America, his old friend James Angleton, the man he had schooled over all those lunches, was never the same. When Angleton finally understood how completely he had been played, something in him broke. He rose to run counterintelligence for the CIA, and he spent years hunting for moles that were not there, tearing his own agency apart from the inside, ruining careers, freezing operations, trusting no one. Philby did not have to lift a finger to do that damage. He had done it years before, over lunch, with a smile. And Britain? Britain stayed silent as long as it could. It took decades, and the defections of others, and the slow prizing open of the archives, before the full shape of the Cambridge Five was admitted. Anthony Blunt, still advising the Queen on her pictures, was not publicly exposed until 1979. The country that had cleared Kim Philby in the House of Commons spent a generation quietly discovering just how wrong it had been. So what is still unanswered? What did the file never close? First, how many people actually died because of Kim Philby? The agents in Albania, the networks rolled up across Europe, Konstantin Volkov and his wife, the men dropped into the dark who were met by soldiers who already knew. No one has ever produced an honest total, and both sides had every reason never to try. Second, why did Nicholas Elliot leave him in Beirut? Elliot sat across from a confessed traitor, and then flew home and left him unguarded beside a Soviet ship. Was it incompetence?
Was it a quiet decision to let a scandal walk itself out a side door rather than drag the Secret Service through a trial? The men who know are gone. Third, how much did Philby give the West in return in his years back inside from Beirut? Was he ever, even for a moment, a genuine double agent working both ways? Or was every scrap of it another layer of the lie? Nobody has ever been able to say for certain. Fourth, did the British government cover for him on purpose? When Macmillan cleared him in Parliament, did they truly believe it? Or did they already suspect the truth and decide that protecting the reputation of the service mattered more than the men Philby was still endangering? And fifth, we ask how a man betrays everyone who ever trusted him, his service, his friends, his wives, his country, and never shows a flicker of regret.
But Kim Philby answered that one himself, and his answer is colder than any question. He said that to betray, you must first belong, and that he never, for one single day, belonged to us at all. I am closing the folder now. He died in Moscow on the 11th of May, 1988, an old man, far from the grey London streets that made him. They buried him with honours. A KGB guard stood over the grave. He had been given Soviet orders and decorations, real ones, the Order of the Red Banner among them, for a lifetime of service to a country he had never lived in until he was past 50. 2 years after his death, they printed his face on a Soviet postage stamp. The English gentleman, the pride of MI6, remembered forever as one of Moscow's own. He was never tried. He was never punished. He was cleared, in public, by the government he had betrayed, and he died a decorated hero of the enemy. The men he sold went into the ground with no names, no honors, and no stamps. Nobody printed their faces on anything. Nobody stood guard over most of their graves. They just stopped. That was the price. He never paid a penny of it. Case closed.